back. Now, let's try this again. Welcome to episode 2 of Nation Urban's Black Folk. I'm your
All right, there we go.
and this is our guest, Mr. Gibbs, the Director of the Foundation. Super excited to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here with you, Brandon. Let me go ahead and put an earpiece on. We're still having difficulties
Awesome.
with audio. And apologies for everyone out there hanging tough with us.
We'll be right here. While we're everyone next week, our week Hill this week with Henry. Next week we're going to talk economics, and so I'm excited about the week that we're doing. So this is all. You're all set up, Henry? Henry is frozen, and that's okay. And that's okay. Sometimes technical difficulties occur, and you have to go through it. But we're not getting off this live again. I'm going to tell you that. And it's just me. So we're going to wait for Henry to come back on, and then we will go from there. Of course, this happens. I'm going to add him. Henry?
All right. I think we're there.
We're good? Okay.
All right, brother.
So that's
crazy. And I'm in the technology space, so it's beyond embarrassing that the phone is loud.
No worries, brother. No worries. So if you can, I don't know, your audio sounds a little off. I just want to make sure everything properly. Henry, if you can, just talk about what you do at the Gates Foundation, because I think that's going to be critical before we even get into the state of Black students and Black education in America.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay now, Brandon?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, so I'm Deputy Director of the Education Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and my team is very much focused on identifying and scaling what we call solutions that are targeted at improving the outcomes of Black, Latino, and low-income students.
Okay.
Those solutions range everywhere from education technology to more traditional instructional materials, books, social emotional learning supports, advising supports to help improve high school post-secondary transition, and a number of other places.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I want to start with a statistic. There are a lot of avenues that we're going to go in this conversation, and unfortunately it's somewhat brief, but I want to touch on a few things. This is from the U.S. Department of Education. I want to read this. I don't want to mess this up. African American students are less likely than white students to have access to college-ready courses. In fact, only 57% of Black students have access to a full range of math and science courses necessary for college readiness, compared to 81% of Asian American students and 71% of white students. So before we get into anything else, let's start with the curriculum. Why is it that curriculums, for majority Black students are not as good or not as refined or not as well as other, ethnicities and other races? Doesn't that already set you up to sort of failure as you go through life and progress through life?
Yeah, it does. And there are a number of reasons, but there are two reasons that come to mind. One is just good old-fashioned bias and structural racism. The second is really connected to school funding and finance and how it works. And so on the first one, I would say, all of the biases and beliefs about Black genius and what Black people are capable of that we see in broader society all walk in to the schoolhouse door. And it starts from day one with educators and other adults in the building, right, who have a perception about what Black children should be able to do, what they deserve, what the aspirations ought to be for them. Right. And that starts from day one. So there's research that shows in preschool, there is already bias on behalf of teachers who are keeping their eye more directly on Black students because they have some perception that they may start trouble. Now, if you look at the cumulative effect of that kind of bias in school, then you can clearly see over time as you get into later grades, it's going to impact educators and other adults' beliefs as to the level of rigor that Black students can actually handle. And so what ends up happening is kind of twofold on that tip. Like, one is just old-fashioned tracking, which has been around for a long time, right? Who actually gets access to courses that are likely to lead to college? Who gets access or tracked out into things that lead to other post-secondary pathways?
Right.
But what the research is also really saying, something that is even more difficult to deal with, which is we're talking about, even within a course, that students of color are actually often given lessons in the same that are less rigorous than their counterparts. And it really does anchor on this question of who do we believe is capable of what. And what's crazy is the students themselves, when surveyed, understand what's happening. They understand when teachers have low expectations for them.
Right.
They understand when the material that's in front of them is not as rigorous. And in fact, they often believe they can do more work. They're just not being asked, and they're not being given the opportunity. So that's kind of one piece on the bias expectations. The other piece on the school side
breaking up a bit
is a lack of funding. So if you kind of think about that cumulative effect for an individual student over time, by the time they get to high school, if they have not gotten what they needed at lower grade levels, you still need to provide supports where those students are. If you have ninth graders who still can't read, they can't do math on grade level, you need to figure out how to reach them where they are. And still, even if you have the mindset around what they should be capable to do, you still have to actually address where they have some gaps in their understanding. At the same time, you don't want to remove opportunities for much more rigorous and advanced and accelerated learning. Right. But those are real choices that sometimes get made at the school level. And this is kind of connected to this question about think about equity in education. That's a really buzzy word right now, but the difference between equity
You're going in and out.
You're
going in and out.
I'm sorry. The difference between equity and equality is we're not talking at this point about equal levels of funding. If you account for that cumulative effect of that student having been underserved for many years, and then if you also think about the cumulative effect that lack of opportunity has been intergenerational, and that student themselves may be going to the same high school that didn't give their parents what they needed. Right. So when you think about the resources then needed to address both the problem of catching students up and making sure that we do not remove opportunities for advancement and rigor, you need more resources so that that choice becomes a false choice. You should be able to do both because that is the reality, but you need the resources to do it.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something you said early on. Basically, there are lowered expectations for Black students and students of color in general. So I'm assuming that would lead to less opportunities for advanced placement courses, which also look better when you're trying to apply for colleges.
No, that's exactly right. And that plays out very regularly. And part of the challenge is a lot of opportunity for more resources in advanced placement, whether it's AP or even earlier grade levels when you're talking about access to gifted and talented programs. It's based on the perspective of an individual teacher. And if that teacher has a bias as to who they believe should get access or not, you actually have situations where some students never even realize that AP is an option for them or are actively discouraged from applying and participating in AP. So they never get access. And so, there's some really powerful programs. One that we support called Equal Opportunity Schools, which really specifically identifies that question of who gets access to AP and who adults in the room and in the buildings truly believe can be successful, and really looks at that as a race equity issue and does some really creative things to identify students that may have gone under-identified previously if it was just based on individual teacher bias and selection, identifies those students and then has the data to back up that those students are in fact as successful as the other students who were handpicked.
Right. So Henry, if there is teacher bias, why aren't there more teachers of color? Someone that looks like these students, that understands where they come from, that can actually assist them and see them for who they are, and not necessarily see them as Black kids that they need to baby or say, we don't really believe in who you are as a.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge, man. I mean, there's a generation gap with respect to the teacher workforce. So, you have had historically larger numbers of Black teachers at different points in time. That is decreasingly the case because teaching is a hard job. And especially if you're a new teacher, the compensation might not be right. And especially if you live in a city where the cost of living is high. So we structurally, when we think about school budgets, we aren't making it necessarily attractive for folks who may have other career choices to make a choice to be a teacher. And that's real. And that's going to increasingly be a tension as greater and greater proportions of an aging workforce retire.
Right.
What are the incentives for Black students to really follow the long tradition of African American teaching and provide additional supports in the ways that you're describing? The structural things that are the impediments there, some of that has a lot to do with compensation and income.
Yeah. So let's talk about supports, right? So there are more law enforcement officers in schools around the country than there are counselors, than there are psychologists. I want to talk about the mental health, or some of that's lacking, particularly for Black students who, look at research, 31% of Black children that are under the age of 18 are living in poverty. How can you expect it to thrive in a school environment when you have to probably worry about what you're eating at night or just surviving at home? Like, why is there such a lack of counselors, of help? Because I think mentally we need that, you know what I mean? Because we're not getting that foundation a lot of the times at home.
Yeah, so I think one thing is that a lot of the issues that you're identifying, which, intersect in the lives of individual Black students, are actually a confluence of different systems, right? So you have the education system, and the question of access to quality healthcare is a different system. And those two systems don't always integrate well within the context of a school. And when they do, a lot of times those counseling services are, to your point, one of the things that get cut. And one of the reasons they get cut go back to a lot of the choices I was mentioning before about looking at finite school budgets and having to make choices. Like, do you cut a counselor? Do you cut a teacher? And those are some of the decisions that folks are making. But there are some schools that are actually figuring out how to integrate those things more creatively. Yeah. And, for instance, mental health services, especially for lower income students, are typically covered by state level Medicaid programs. And so there are schools that are figuring out how to create more integrated models where they are creating space for that type of psych counseling that ultimately is paid for by Medicaid to be more deeply integrated into what's happening in school, even if those budgets are coming from different places.
So let me ask, I mean, with COVID-19, it feels like these disparities have been enhanced. I can tell you personally, in Philadelphia, the school district of Philadelphia, handed out Chromebooks for everybody in the district. But that first week of the virtual learning, once they were out of school, only 50% of students actually attended a virtual course versus, other school districts who are wealthier, who have more of a per pupil allotment. They have more money for the districts. Their students have already been doing virtual courses for years before. They're already accustomed to doing this. How has COVID really affected, the educational system and how it's going to look, particularly as we go back into the fall, because students will have not been in school for 7 months. How is that going to impact Black students, low income students, students of color in general versus the general population?
Yeah. Now, can you still hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. So it's interesting because part of what COVID-19 did was actually just expose a bunch of the inequities that we knew were there before and blew them wide open in a relatively short period of time so that they could no longer be denied, right? And so even in the examples that you mentioned from your hometown in Philly, and seeing that there were certain students that had the support they needed to then log on, and the district knew where they were.
Right.
This is another point of intersection between these different structures, right? So I know that there's this imagery around, the professional career holder who has now been able to shift to work from home, and now their biggest challenge is balancing their work with having to figure out how to homeschool their kid. And I don't want to take anything away from that. Like that, those are real challenges. That was not easy for a bunch of folks. But when we look at the Black community and we then overlay low-income communities on top of that, the proportion of folks that had the ability to work from home was far lower. Mm-hmm. So the stats clearly say that white folks can work from home at a rate that's 50% greater than Black folks. 50%, right? And so if you think about even the impact of COVID-19 and this question of economic mobility and people's jobs, mm-hmm. and the fact that a higher proportion of Black folks were considered essential workers, right? Whether they were actually involved directly in healthcare or they were in other service industries that required them to continue going to work.
Yeah.
Those parents were not at home to be able to provide support to the degree that other parents were. Even if you did get to a place where you had devices and broadband, it is still not equitable in those. And so like these deep connections, man, between wealth and race and education are exactly the things that COVID-19 has blown apart. And so some of the learning loss that you're talking about is actually, so to be 100% real, the field does not 100% know yet what has happened with these students. They were gone for several months. Mm-hmm. The types of assessments to understand what their learning is on a regular basis were not being done. Mm-hmm. Even regular grading was not being done consistently. They're going to be gone for another 3 months in summer. We have yet to fully understand what the impact will be. But just based on modeling, it's already really clear that those students who had the least are the ones that are going to have the hardest, who have had the hardest time and will have the hardest time. So there's been a bunch of models that have been done that actually look at projected learning loss. So there's this thing that happens every year called summer slide, mm-hmm. right? And some folks may be familiar with it. If you had a kid, have a child, you've probably seen the summer slide and maybe didn't have a name for it, but it's effectively when students end a given school year and they're now gone for the summer for 2.5 to 3 months, there's a sliding of what they were able to demonstrate that they understood and could do when they walked out of that room for the summer to begin, and what they then come back in the fall to be able to demonstrate they still understand. And that's well known. There are divides driven by both race and income that show greater summer slide for Black, Latino, low-income students. If you model and look at where students were the last time we could assess them when they were actually in schools, and then you apply those models based on the demographics and what we know in the past and project that to 6 months of being out, there are some scenarios where, in equivalent scenarios, where white students are projected to lose 6 months of learning, which may be roughly equal to the amount of time they were actually out of school. You have scenarios where Black students are projected to lose 10 months of learning. And part of that is because of the lack of equity of access and support during the shutdown, but also a recognition that during the summer, as every summer, depending on what your family situation is, you may have very different access to summer supports, right, that actually create fun learning opportunities for students that keep that learning fresh so that when they get back in the fall, they haven't lost as much.
So let me ask something else, because there's a piece of this, and this one's personal to me because I'm in the music industry, because I'm around creative individuals, and we see that arts funding, music funding, dwindle of school districts. Is that more significant for students of color, for low-income students, than it is for students that are already thriving, or is that overrated? Do we necessarily need much as we need other, core subjects?
No, I believe you need it all, because there are some students that those programs are the only thing keeping them coming to school.
Yeah,
those are the things that are actually engaging them, and it's not like they have genius that is any less than other students.
Right.
But in terms of their engagement and what they find relevant, there are any number of ways that different students and their perspectives of who they are and how they engage with the world and what they believe is possible for themselves and what they're interested in requires a bunch of different approaches to engage the students, to get them in the building, and then have any shot at connecting both the academics and the social and emotional learning development that you're hoping to provide them,
Right.
to situate them for success. So I think that question of relevance is deeply important, particularly for students of color.
So is that lack of emotional and social support that you're speaking of, is that the reason why it seems to be more Black students are suspended or expelled as opposed to other races? Or, are they being targeted in these schools because of that bias that you spoke of at the beginning of the interview?
Yeah, so that bias is real. And the other part of
You're breaking up.
at Yale, that bias that was identified among teachers in preschool is connected to a devastating stat, which is that Black preschoolers are suspended at a rate that is 3.6 times higher than white students.
Preschool?
Preschool. 3.6 times higher. And we're talking about preschool kids. So if that's happening then, and it is based on, either people's, internal bias or things that are more overt in terms of.
You're frozen. Just as you were getting into a good point.
Access to.
Froze a bit. Back up.
You breaking up again? Am I breaking up?
Froze a little bit. I want to make sure people hear this point.
Yeah. So that point is, it isn't, you have multiple tracks. So you have, access to high level, rigorous, college ready content. You got access to lower level tracks. And then you have access to the prison pipeline.
Yeah.
And so that's, there is that challenge, especially in some school districts, which are beginning to look at how they interact with city police. To your point, with who they use as resource officers in schools. I think it was Minneapolis, just given, the protests that have emerged after the murder of George Floyd. The school district actually went back and reflected and said, hey, we have a contract up for renewal with the Minneapolis Police Department to be resource officers in our school. You know what? That actually may not be a great idea. Right. We may actually want to take a different approach to conflict resolution, to security in different ways that are more. So I think a lot of those conversations are happening now. But the question, I think, is deeply rooted in bias. But what's so insidious about that, man, is kids understand when people have low expectations for them.
Right.
So after a while, everything in your school environment and everything in your adult relationships in that school are pointing toward a lack of belief in what you're worth and then of course that's your own mindset around your growth mindset and your ability to continue to stretch and grow intellectually, your mindsets around your own identity formation, your mindsets around what school is even for and is it relevant?
Yeah. So we talked about not even all the issues. We talked about maybe 20 to 30% of the issues, right? But I want to, part of the reason we started this series is for me, for the person who's not in education every day, for the parents, for those that just love our children. What are action steps? What are things that we can do today to at least curb the tide on this, to help somehow, without necessarily being in the educational field every day like you are, Henry?
Yeah, so one, I love that you asked that question. And two, what I will immediately say is, given all of the complexities that we talked about, there is no single silver bullet. And so, I want to display any bit that is possible to have the one thing that we can collectively do. But I will say that whether you're a parent or a constituent, the local politics and all politics being local are actually a really important point of entry into these conversations in figuring out how to ensure school districts support our kids. School boards are typically elected. A lot of times people don't pay attention to those school board elections. But those school boards are the ones who are setting policy, making decisions about how much money is being spent, They're making decisions about hiring and teacher contracts. They're making decisions about various types of acceleration supports. They're making decisions on who the superintendent is, because they typically are the ones who hire the superintendent.
Mm.
I would actually challenge everybody to go look at the school budget in their home school district and understand how much money is in there, because a lot of people don't realize that school districts are actually multi-billion-dollar enterprises. They're huge. They spend a lot of resources on a lot of different things. Understanding what that budget is, but then most importantly, just showing up and actually voting for school boards, and then showing up to school meetings and actually listening and creating opportunities to actually voice your concerns. I would also say, like, there are ways to begin to hold individual school staff and also
You're
looking and asking some key questions, right? So if we acknowledge that this question of bias is deeply important and impacts the outcomes for Black students, then it ought to follow that the schools and school districts ought to be identifying that as a specific challenge and doing something about it. Like, have they actually focused on any adult training to address that bias? There are organizations like the Pacific Education Group, which does a whole thing around creative boy, I'm blanking on the name of the Courageous Conversations.
Okay.
And their whole premise is to accept that public education is inherently biased, and those adult to adult relationships that dictate what decisions look like and what school culture looks like need to be addressed in that lens.
Mm-hmm.
That student to adult relationship needs to be addressed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask whether or not they are actively doing anything to address school culture and school environment, and then measure against it. There are a bunch of different surveys that measure against school climate and school environment, that bring in voices of students and teachers and get underneath some of these questions around what the culture actually looks like. I'd also even get really specific, and to the point we were talking about earlier with who gets access to resources,
Right.
depending on who gets defined as promising. Gifted and talented programs in elementary school, are typically tested for in third grade. But again, just like AP in high school, in a lot of places, the policy is that individual teachers are making the call on who they believe holds promise, and who they believe ought to even be tested to then get access to the program. And it's like, no, like that genius is evenly distributed by zip code. And if we believe that, then you should test all kids. Test all of them. And then I guarantee if you press on that district to test all of those kids, the data will show that the level of that genius that already resides in those classrooms and already resides in those schools is much higher than anybody actually believed. And then you actually have a shot at getting students those additional resources instead of actually tracking them out from the rip.
Perfect. I mean, those I think are great starting points for us to really think about, and particularly that local school board, because honestly, I didn't even know that, to be honest. That what were you gonna say, Henry?
Well, I was going to say, like, one clear example, and it's New York City, which is the largest school district in the country. Any guess as to what their annual budget is?
I'm not even going to guess. I'm not going to look crazy on here. Tell me.
Their 1920 budget, I believe, was $34 billion.
34 billion?
34 billion. Now, it's a huge district, but if you look at other districts, like even your smaller districts that are nowhere near that size are still in the hundreds of millions annually. Where's the money going?
Right.
And you can actually have something to say about it.
So why is it okay? And I know we have to wrap it up, but I'm really curious. Why is, particularly in certain, urban centers, why are the per pupil allotments so much lower than they are in other townships and other districts that aren't as densely populated and arguably have more Black and brown kids in them?
See, now you get into the meat of the intersection of some of these structures, and that's a whole other conversation. It's it really does depend on the state. There are some states that have different balances of how much of a school district's budget proportionally comes from the state versus a locality.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, the question of resources is driven by local context, and it's by design,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you look at local context and recognize that it is often primarily driven by the real estate tax base, and there's a deep connection between real estate and education that has historically been there. So if folks, recognize the policy of redlining,
Mm-hmm.
and the impact that that had on underdevelopment of Black communities, if you then recognize that school district zoning and funding that flows based on real estate taxes has to be connected to the history of what happened with underdevelopment of Black communities. And so some of that is driven because of connection to how taxes are drawn upon
Mm-hmm.
locally. But then even in situations where states and school districts try to be more equitable in their funding and push more funding to schools that have higher proportions of students in need, the reality is that folks who have are going to always do whatever they can to support their students more.
Right.
And so what you end up finding is even in a given school district where you may have wide variation in what a school looks like based on neighborhoods, even if you by luck had a funding situation where by design it was more equitable, those PTAs at those schools are fundraising machines that then provide even greater access to students that are in wealthier neighborhoods, even if you try to address it with more equitable funding. So like this question of the connection between income and wealth and education is really layered.
Yeah.
But it is super real.
Henry, I could probably go on for another hour because I'm always fascinated with this sort of information, particularly around education, but we do need to wrap up. I wanted just to personally thank you and the teachers and the administrators who do care, because I think that the work that you're doing is the most important work, because it leads to every generation now and thereafter. And I'm going to put this out publicly. I know we spoke privately about it, but I want to put it out publicly because it keeps me accountable, and I think accountability is important when we're talking about this. Whatever you need from Live Nation Urban, from Brandon Pankey, in the work that you do so that we can help our kids, I will be here, because I think it's beyond important, and I'm really appreciative of you making time for us today.
Amen. Listen, I appreciate this. Looking forward to coming on since I saw Mark Lamont Hill tear it up last week. This is a great forum. I'm looking forward to the ones going forward. I appreciate the invitation, but more so, I appreciate that commitment. And likewise for me, if there's any opportunity that I can pull you in, or that you can pull me in, I'm all in, brother. Thank you for the opportunity.
Likewise. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Henry Hips, Deputy Director of Educational Services with the Gates Foundation. Thank you again, Henry. Appreciate it. This has been Brandon Pankey. This has been episode 2 of The Souls of Black Folk. Next week, the focus is economics. I think a lot of what Henry talked about actually skews in perfectly when talking about the economic disparities and those gaps between Blacks and other races in America. So we're excited to keep this series going. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week. Thanks again, Henry.
Thank you.
Take care.